Okay, welcome to Mark Masucci, who is been working with SBS International for quite a few years, been SBS since '92, but did your SBS when? In 1980?
86, 87?
Okay, in Kona.
Virginia.
Virginia, okay, Virginia, all right, awesome. And then Sarah, who is on our staff, who has been basically the last 3 years, did our SBS and then staff 2 years here in Montana. And then Tom Hoseen, who did his SBS in 2001, 2, and then came on staff and has been here since then, and he's been over SBS. So thank you for coming. We're going to be answering these 3 questions. How do I study for an SBS lecture? How do I put the lecture together? Different things that come to your mind, and things I can think about in delivery. Yay, thank you. All right, so let's start for the first one. Mark, you want to start?
A good thing I like to use is, and it sounds simple and sounds basic and we do it all the time, but I go back, I get a clean text, photocopy it out, print it out. There's all kinds of websites that you can get any version you want. I'll usually use the RSV because that's the one that I'm familiar with, or the ESV because most classes are using that. And then for larger books, say a Matthew or even something like a Hebrews, kind of a mid-range, so read it 10, 12, 15 times. Small books like a Galatians or Ephesians, 30, 35 times. A large book like a Jeremiah or Kings, hopefully get it a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. And then once I'm familiar again with that and it's on a clean sheet, I start by, you go back and you ask and answer 20, 25 observation questions a chapter. And just go back and really just do the method again and again and again. So make observations and try and take into interpretation and just start there. And I usually find that about halfway through, I've got more stuff going on in my brain than I know what to do with. And
Okay. So that's studying, right?
yeah, that's the study part.
Yeah.
Initially.
Yeah.
I do that too. I always start with a clean text, and I'll read through it multiple times, and then I'll do historical background, and then read through it again with that kind of in my mind. And then I'll color code it, and I find for me, color coding is probably the most beneficial step, probably because I'm a visual learner. So as I'm color coding it, I do it with colors and I do it with a pencil. And with colors, I'll do a sentence or so, and then any questions I have, I leave margins on the side of my sheet so that I can write out my questions as I go. And that just helps me know what I'm going to want to look at for the whole book. Things I would think of as a student, things I've seen in the past. If I have LCs that I can think about, I pulled those in there too at that point. So that on one sheet of paper, not only have I read it, but I have everything of where I'm going to go. Kind of like he does with all the questions that he asks. I do it on the same sheet. And for studying, I'll try to, if I know where my students are going to look, I'll try to look in those books for BRI stuff so I can see what they're going to get and look elsewhere so that I can see if I can add anything to it or have those answers. Because most of the time people here will get their BRI information from 4 or 5 different sources and we know them, so why not look at them? So I'll do that as well and have that information. I like to listen to lectures in the past. These guys are great. Strongly recommend it. You'll find certain teachers fit your style a little bit more sometimes, so you'll learn better from different lectures that you listen to. I know people that I'm not going to learn as much from, so I just won't listen to their lectures, but I'll find other people that I might. Sometimes it's a guessing game. You never know with the old people that are out there what you can find. So I think it's not old people, older staff, not older people in age, older as in they were on staff before.
Past staff.
Past staff. That's a good word for it. Past staff. And I'll listen to their lectures and see how they do it. The best part about listening to a lecture is that it's already geared towards an SBS audience, and so they think about things in an SBS mindset. So it's nice to listen to theirs. It's helpful.
Yeah, I wouldn't add, my method is fairly similar to that in that I like to start with a clean text as well. I also will print it with a huge gutter, 2 column with a huge gutter and wide margins. So that gives me room, because I actually teach out of my text and not out of my notes. And so then as well, I'm doing observation stuff in my text, and I'm also writing notes and pulling out things that I think are important, so that when I'm going through my text later, you know, I will have things starred that like that I need to, because especially in a bigger book, you're not going to do a verse by verse, for example, so you're going to have to identify those things that really do that are kind of crucial to the author's logic possibly, or to if you're tracking a particular theme or whatever through, you want to take those key connection points and draw people's attention to them as you fly through there. So in a bigger book, where you're not going verse by verse, that I will do that. The other thing that I tend to do lately, and I've found it really helpful, is that my first couple of readings aren't actually readings. I will listen to the text. And the advantage to that for me is kind of twofold. One, I can be looking at the text while that's going on. And two, when it's read, it goes at conversation speeds, and the good reading sites will have people in there that will even change voices for different characters. They will speak in it, they will read it in a more spoken rhythm. The rhythm's important, because when you're reading fast, you don't read naturally, and so you'll miss inflection, you'll miss emphasis, you'll miss a lot of things sometimes when you're reading fast. And in a big book, it's very tempting to read fast. So rather, you know, to avoid the fatigue, like when I did Samuel recently, I listened to that 2 or 3 times, which that's 2 or 3 days right there.
Yeah.
You know, but like on a Saturday or something, I'll just fire that thing up and let it go and I'll have my text open there, and if I hear something interesting, I'll be like, oh, and I'll go look at that, and so that's how I tend to start. And I think the advantage to that is it shakes you out of like your own agenda a little bit, because you're just listening, and you're trying to let the text speak, which is a good thing when you're teaching in SBS. If you're trying to be inductive, you want to let the text speak. So I've been doing that lately and finding that to be a nice lead off, because it gives you a real sense of the flavor of the book and the real emphasis of the author before you dive in and try to like dissect everything. So I've been doing a little of that lately as well. So yeah, otherwise it's a very similar process in that I like to start with a clean text. I don't always, but in a new book, absolutely. You know, in an older book, I will every once in a while. I've done it, I think, about 3 times in Revelation, for example, because I've taught that, I don't know, 20-something times. And I've started over about 3 times now, where you just like, okay, that's been fun, so I'm just going to start with a clean one again and see what I see this time. And so I think not getting stale after you do it for a while is a whole other subject probably, but like that's important as well.
Tom, can I ask a question? What are some of those sites that you were mentioning?
What now?
What are some of those websites you were mentioning for reading the text?
Well, the actual ESV site, for example, is one. But the one I like lately is Bible Is. I do it on my tablet. It's an app,
Okay.
and it's
Bible is?
Bible.is.
Oh.
Yep. And that is actually an awesome thing. I think Smith recommended it to me, and it's really good. And so that one I do, but even the regular sites like Bible Gateway or the ESV, official ESV site, I think that has an Audible track as well, an audio track, I mean. And so there's actually quite a variety of free resources online for listening to the text.
You just have to look for like the little speaker
Yeah.
next to it.
Yeah. So.
So what are you
the-
doing?
The one thing I would add to is that I do very little work in external sources early on. Very, very little. I mean, I may look at just a background or audience thing, a question, you know, just to make sure I'm thinking about it right, you know. But beyond that, I don't like commentaries. I don't like to, because they all have well, they're teaching as well, you know, and they have chosen a road through the text generally. Well, is that the one that God wants me to take through this text for this group of people? Highly unlikely, honestly. And so, although it's not useless, I don't start there. I don't. That is something that after I've processed it for a long time, I might then say, okay, let's see what some of these other dudes do with this. Or if I get stuck, if I end up in a place where I'm stuck, then I tend to start going, all right, how do people do this? And I think that's part of studying when you're studying difficult passages. I prefer to give 2, maybe 3 approaches to it, you know, which means you're going to do some reading, you know. So, but I don't start there, and I think that's important because I've seen people start there, and I think that's a mistake because it tends to bend your whole approach to the book.
Not getting to know the book before you.
Yeah.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Warning off that. I taught John, and to me, John is like a foreign language, and I hated it. And I was like, I don't understand what he's doing, so.
What is wrong with
I
you?
know! I say I love teaching John, okay. I like Paul, okay? He's very linear, I like the way he thinks, I can understand where he's going. John's like, here's a picture, and wow. So I was teaching John, and I was getting lost, and I didn't have a lot of time, and so in the midst of trying to understand it, I want the answers for everything, I want to understand every verse, and that's just kind of how my mind works. I had like 5 commentaries I would hold out, and I'd be like, did you explain it well? No, still don't understand. Did you explain it well? Nope. And then I would go, but all 5 of them had a different look at the text, and so in compiling that lecture, I had this meld of different ideas that I was so lost and so confused. Please don't do that. It's the worst. So try to stay out of them if you can. I agree with that.
Well, and the other thing before I move on to putting it together that I didn't mention, and it's so obvious that it almost seems like you don't need to, but I think you really do, and that is Jesus is the actual teacher, and prayer is a huge thing. And when I study, I don't tend to study in huge blocks of time. I tend to study in bursts and then give it time to process and to pray about it. And that, maybe it's just the way my brain is wired, but that does help me in that I will look at something hard for a bit and then back away from it and let it cook. You know, and pray about it and think about it. And that tends to help me because, well, for a lot of reasons. I think that when you're in front of an SBS, for example, that's not a randomly occurring event. That is something that God has ordained. That is a place that God has put you in. He has a message. You will know that message as much from prayer as you will from the text. I think He will speak to you from the text through prayer. And that's the actual message to bring to that class. I think to overlook that and take this as a purely academic exercise is to, I think it's just a mistake, frankly. I think you're missing something if you approach it purely academically. You will miss something because you're in a room with a certain group of people at a certain time for a reason. And that reason is not going to be found in a commentary. That's going to be found through the Spirit of God. And the only way you get that is through prayer. And there is absolutely no way to overstate the importance of prayer and study. And we haven't talked about it yet, I'm sure we all do it, but I just, for the sake of completeness, like you really cannot overstate the importance of that. Like, it's just not possible.
Amen.
And you know the difference when you're in front of a class and you're just giving them facts, or if you're in front of the class and you're saying what God's put on your heart to share with them. And they know the difference too. So, yeah.
Going back to your last point, when you do it in spurts, you study in spurts. I remember Judy Smith telling me, because I had been studying a book and I was studying a book and I was studying a book, and she's like, Anna, you need to just go take a walk. And just think about it. And I was like, oh, I guess I can do that. Like, it was like, helped me a lot because, and so I think that's actually.
Well, in practice, like I've had many staff that I've come into like the office or something, and they're almost catatonic. You know, they're just staring there. They've been there for hours. And I'm like, dude, you have officially studied yourself stupid. You need to unplug and get the heck out of here, like, immediately, like, before you damage something. You know? So, I mean, there is this notion that, like, you know, you keep doing that until it gives, you know, and I don't think that's the way we work, frankly. And maybe some people do, I shouldn't say it like that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some people that have told me that, you know, once they get into the zone, they can't break out, or else they have to start over and it takes them an hour to get refocused or whatever. If that's you, okay, you figure it out with God then. But for me, and for I think quite a few people that I've talked to, I think that focus and freshness is an important part of, especially creative thought. I don't think you can be very creative in a state of mental exhaustion. And so I think there's some real advantages there. It should at least be tried by people before they decide that it doesn't work for them, I think. Yeah.